It's happening.
Okay. So welcome everybody. This is the next season of APT GameGenerator and the first talk. And today we're going to hear Ott talk about rapid game prototyping. So here you go.
Yes, thank you. For those of you, oh shit, I have sound on this laptop, so the stream started perfect. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Ott. I am by now a game industry veteran. I have about 15 years of experience in the gaming industry, with 6 of those years in doing professional game dev and getting paid for it, etc. If you get paid for it, then you're professional, basically. I've worked in Germany for almost 5 years, and after that I came to Estonia. So I've worked on Heroes of Might and Magic 7, for example, Tropico 6, Disco Elysium, previously known as No Truce with the Furies, and then a number of smaller projects and prototypes, both internal and some that actually have made it into fully fledged games. Today I would like to share my knowledge about how I go about prototyping games in my spare time, for actual projects, for basically made-to-order projects, for example for outsourcing studios, etc. I mostly come from a programming background, but in the recent years, in the last 2-3 years, I've put more of my efforts into production and design. Production meaning basically team management, product management, planning, basically figuring out how to make a game and getting other people on board with this kind of plan. And also game design itself, I mostly am comfortable with implementing design that has already been thought out, but sometimes I like to come up with my own game designs and see where they take me. The key takeaway from this talk would be to use your time wisely, because since I'm talking about rapid prototyping, time is going to be of the essence at everything, at every technique that we look at. Because if we are talking from a industry standpoint, then time equals money, and if you spend too much time on something while not getting that much in return, that actually means you're spending your money, your resources on something that you will not get a return on. So some key takeaways immediately that you should remember or note down somewhere. Make sure that you're using your time effectively, and secondly, you should immediately know when to let go of something to make sure that you don't spend too much time on it. Because in the end, if you don't have a game plan of what you are going to do with your time, then any sort of new venture that you're taking, any sort of new prototype that you're going to be working on, you might start spending time way inefficiently, and then you might burn out, or you might not get the results you're looking for. And while you might actually have a solid prototype on your hands, you might not have played your cards correctly to actually do something with it. Because it can happen that if you are a startup studio, you manage to secure some seed funding, even if it's like a couple of €1,000, you spend that money into making something that you can't actually proceed with. You make something that has too large of a scope. For example, you can't continue it as a real project, or you might just not end up somewhere, because you might not even end up anywhere, because you decided to spend your money and your resources in a place where you won't get anything in return. So don't end up being like this. Make sure that you plan your time ahead when you are starting a new project, and be careful with where you put in your time, because otherwise it's like if you make prototype after prototype, you actually want to get a result. Now to get a few quick disclaimers about this talk. First of all, we are not going to talk about something that will solve all of your problems in terms of prototyping. Secondly, I'm not going to teach you game design or anything even very much connected with game design. And thirdly, I will probably not touch up on any sort of concrete idea that you can use in your current game project, because what I'm going to talk about is starting from scratch and getting from point A to point B. So what you should be expecting from this talk is where to start out, how to organize your ideas, what kind of techniques to use to get those ideas to a tangible place where you can share them with others, for example, and you also have a better idea of what you're trying to achieve on your own. Then I'm going to talk to you about what kind of tools to use to get to this place, and what kind of mental preparation you should take for this, and what mindset to have. Then what kind of materials, like open materials, resources that you can go through to kind of reinforce your ideas and get more comfortable with the idea of making a prototype. And then lastly, of course, an open discussion with all of us here today and with the people coming in on stream if you have any questions. The talk itself is going to be about 1.5 hours with a little bit of a pause in between. We're going to get to that quickly, pretty quickly. So you will all be let go around 9 p.m. If that's basically the worst case scenario. But yeah, this is going to be quite a heavy technical talk on how to manage your time, how to manage your resources, and where to put your focus. So let's start out. This is basically game prototyping in a nutshell. You want to have a pen and paper notebook. You want to have some sort of a code project running to see if you can validate your idea. You want to keep physically fit. You're going to lose your mind a little bit, and then maybe in the end you will end up with something like this that you can actually look at and play. Getting through all of these stages is part of making a prototype. You need to take into account that whenever you start working on an idea, you have to start out with structuring it. If you know what you are going to do beforehand, and you have a vague idea, even a vague idea of something that you want to achieve, you are going to have a much better time when you start executing it. So when you are starting out to formulate your idea, maybe you're talking with some friends at a pub or at this kind of an event, or maybe you're at a game jam, then you want to get your idea into a place where you can easily share it with others, and you can start taking it into smaller pieces so you can analyze it to see how difficult it would be to execute it, and basically come up with solutions to the problems that you have thought up. So where do we start? I use personally a feature-based approach, and this means that whenever I come up with a game idea, or actually I'm already getting way ahead of myself, if I get a game-related idea, I want to break it down into small granular pieces, which I would call features, because a game is basically a collection of features and mechanics. So what this enables is that if you have an idea, you want to basically make that into a tangible thing that you can explain to somebody else. Even if that somebody else is yourself, you need to tell yourself somehow that, okay, I want to make a game that's like Minecraft, for example. That's a silly example, but it works. Then you start out by, okay, what does Minecraft have? It has blocks, it has crafting. You start taking apart an idea and making it smaller and smaller into smaller bits and pieces, which you can analyze and then tackle as you go. Or for example, I want to make a strategy game. So for a strategy game, I would need to have units probably. In those units, I would probably have worker units and soldier units. Then maybe I would have support units. Maybe these units would have abilities, these support units. So you start up having this kind of dependency tree, and these are already features in your game. And once you have all of these features laid out, then you can start analyzing how difficult of a problem it is that you're trying to solve. So if you go into prototyping with the idea of I'm going to try and make this entire game at once, then you will probably hit the wall really, really fast. So instead, what I would encourage you to do is to try and prototype features instead. So instead of saying that, okay, I'm going to start prototyping a real-time strategy game, tell yourself, I'm going to prototype units, for example. I don't want to talk about the real-time strategy part at all. I just want to have units moving in a 3D world. I want to have blocky dudes walking from one end of the level to another, and then let's see where I can push this. So you start out with the idea of maybe making an RTS game, but by mindset you turn into taking these taking the elements of an RTS game and making them very, very small, and making them basically understandable and solvable for yourself, because you might not immediately know how to make an RTS game from start to finish, but you might already know how to make a soldier move from point A to point B, or you can Google it, for example, because the more detailed you go into a feature, the better of a chance you will have that somebody has already done this before, so you don't have to go about reinventing the wheel. So for example, if you go to, this might sound very, very simple, but if you would go to the almighty Google and ask how to make an RTS game, this is a significantly harder question to answer. How do I make a 3D object move in a game engine, for example? It's a much easier, let's say, problem to solve, and you already have a feature if you complete this. The next step from that would be, okay, I have units, they move, I want them to interact with one another. So you add another layer, another feature basically. So let's put stats on top of these units. So they have sort of a state machine attached, they have health, and they have damage. So let's say once one unit is next to another unit, then they start doing damage to each other every 1 second, for example. This again is something that is tangible. It's a small problem that you can start solving almost immediately. You can use resources to reference, like for example, documentation for game engines, going on forums, checking out if somebody has done this before. Obviously they have. And then figure out figure out the design that you would like to see yourself. So maybe instead of the one unit doing damage every 1 second, maybe you want the different kinds of units to have a different kind of attack rate, a different kind of damage, different kind of health value. So you just expand complexity on top of the system that you already have, instead of starting out with a huge complex idea and then trying to do everything at the same time, because that's a great way of stressing yourself out and needing to take melatonin on a Wednesday afternoon. Basically, you can get a lot of stuff done just by trying to make it into a tiny atomic granular bit, and then solving this problem and moving on to the next problem. So if you have an idea, make a short sketch out of it, what you're trying to achieve, put the end goal in sight, and see what kind of features you would end up with, what kind of features you would need to end up in this situation, and then start taking these features apart. So that's pretty much how I do it. That's how I've approached analysis as well for other games, for example. If I want to figure out a game, then this is what I use. Basically, I go into a game, I start playing it, and then I start analyzing, okay, why is this working the way it is? Like, for example, just recently, the past weekend, I played about 7 hours of Civilization 6. It was great. It was a huge time sink, but I wasn't playing it for fun. I was playing it to actually understand what the designers were trying to do. So I try to analyze, why am I being allowed to take this action, for example? Why is my unit behaving like this? And why does the UI of the game tell me this information at this current time? So I started taking all of these different aspects into pieces, and then suddenly I started understanding the design behind it. And then I understand how streamlined and optimized their design was. In my opinion, like Civilization 6 is a very, very well designed game because it has this kind of deep design where people have obviously spent a lot of time figuring out how players see the game. And this is also a positive effect of having a feature-based approach, because people who are playing your game will never experience your game as the big picture, as the vision that you have envisaged for yourself. They will only perceive the game based on the features you allow them to experience the game through. So if you have a good set of game features that are fun and memorable for the player, then you will also have a memorable game. Even if the vision behind the game isn't that coherent, if the execution of the features is correct, concise, and fun, then your players will enjoy it more. In essence, basically, it means also less is more in a way, because if you have less features in the game, but they are more well executed, then you have a nice streamlined experience and a good focus for your game. Make lots of notes, essentially. Whenever you are starting with a new idea, start writing stuff down, because you will forget whatever you were thinking about 2 hours into something else. So whenever you have a good idea, you want to get it out of your head, take a notebook, take a pencil, write it down, and just offload it. And then you don't have to deal with it in your head anymore. And then you can move on to the next problem, whether it's connected to your game or something happening in your life. At least you have got rid of this problem immediately, and you have put it somewhere in a safe storage. Or use a Google Doc. Just type down all of your ideas and refine them later. Then I have a bullet point here which says focus on mechanics. There's an important distinction to be made between a feature and a mechanic. A feature, for me at least, is something that the game offers you to experience the game through, and a mechanic is something that you as a player have to execute, or it's basically a string of actions that the player can execute to interface with a feature. For example, if we have a feature that there's spells in the game, for example, then a mechanic would be that you select somebody who can cast spells in the game, you select the spell, you select the target of the spell is being cast, and then lots of stuff happens in between. There's some visual effects, etc. So the part where you actually click through something to get the spell you want to cast, that's the mechanic. And what you see on the screen is basically a feature, because the feature also has the visual effects, the sound effects, etc. attached to it, because that's the idea, what you want to have. If you want to have spell casting as a feature, then you will have some expectations. You want to have a fireball, you want to have an explosion. It needs to lead somewhere for the player. You want to give them an experience. And then I also bring up the topic of whiteboxing. Does anybody know what whiteboxing means, or should I explain it? Okay. Whiteboxing means that whenever you make a prototype of something, then you don't make it look the way it's supposed to look or the way it looks in your head. You just use placeholder graphics, you use placeholder mechanics. Like let's say I want to implement spellcasting, but I want to skip the mana part. Like I don't want my spells to cost mana right now because I don't have time to implement a mana system, like all this math and whatever. Fuck it. I will just go and create this system where if you press this button on the user interface, you will get something that pops up that will be like a fireball, and it can be just a white sphere. It doesn't have to be a fireball. It can be just a regular solid sphere with no texture attached that flies to a certain location and makes something else disappear. That's your spell. And then you can modify the behavior of this. Do you want it to go in a straight line? Do you want it to like home in as a homing missile whenever the target is moving? You can customize this already. You don't need to make it look fancy to see if it works or not. So instead of putting your time into let's make this fireball look really fancy and then make it behave properly, then you might be wasting time because you're doing these visuals on false pretenses. And this whiteboxing principle goes to even can be extended to visual features, like features that don't necessarily explain to you how anything in the game works, but is just there to provide visual feedback for something. So, for example, if you want to have a feature in your game which is something connected to destructible environments, for example, you want to have a cave in a cave where a passage just gets filled up with rocks, for example. You don't have to use actual rocks, just use solid cubes to give you an idea of what you want the visual behavior of this to be. So you don't waste time in making assets or getting assets created for yourself to actually see how the behavior would work, because you can already modify the behavior by testing it with placeholder assets. And now the reverse engineering, the design part, we will go into pretty much now. So this is going to be the small segment where we have an open discussion. You have a screenshot of a game. Does anybody recognize what this game is?
Path of Exile?
Yes, thank you. It's Path of Exile. It's a top-down action RPG, which some people would call a Diablo clone, and I would agree. It's basically a spiritual successor to Diablo 2, or the game type, game mode, or gameplay that Diablo 2 was trying to achieve, and a bunch of dudes got together and made this game. Now, just looking at this screenshot, I would like to go through with you with a short feature analysis. So, if anybody here sees a feature that they can put into words, I would like them to do so, just by looking at this picture. There's a lot of info here. There's graphics, there's user interface, as you can see, if you can see it in the far back. There's a quick select thing that has console buttons on them, so this is taken from a PS4 version of the game. So what kind of features do you see here, for example?
Magic.
Yes, magic, spellcasting. So you see that the main character is here. There is some fiery stuff happening, for example. So yeah, we have a magic system. So what can we say about the magic system just by looking at this? Can we go further with it? Can we go into more detail?
It uses mana.
Yes, it uses mana. Great. That's already one more feature that we have. We have resource management in the game, with one of the resources being mana. Now, just judging by this screenshot itself, do we have any other obvious hints within this screenshot that would deal with mana?
There are mana potions, health potions, and the cooks outfits.
Yes, exactly. So we have resource management tools in the UI as well. There's mana potions, there's health potions. Anything else?
Skill tree.
Yes, we can extrapolate that probably this game would have a skill tree already, just from this screenshot. Judging by what's happening here, by this large area covered by fire, what can we say about the ability system?
Area of effect.
Yes, we have area of effects.
That's a map.
Yep, exactly. We probably have, there's fire damage, resists elemental damage, so we're already talking about a resistance system as well. We're talking probably about debuffs and buffs. If we're talking about area of effects, then we're probably also talking about single target effects. So you can see that the rabbit hole can get really deep, really fast. So this is why if, for example, any of you would get an idea, I would like to make an action RPG game, then I would encourage you to just either play a game in the action RPG genre, or take a look at the pictures and see what they're trying to show you. What is the expected feature set if somebody would just go in and want to say, I want to play an action RPG game. And if you start writing down all the stuff, there's going to be tons of features in this kind of system. And only then, if you start writing them, actually start physically writing them down, your hand is going to get tired because there's so much stuff. So if I would like to list like everything that I see in this picture, there's going to be, there's the minimap, there's a character dot, there's some sort of AI controlling these guys. They all have stats, they have health. You have health, you have mana, you have spell casting, probably have a skill tree. There's a hotkey system somewhere embedded in here. How do I even change like these quick slots? There has to be a system for this. There has to be a system for handling all this input. There has to be a way that I move the character somehow. Like, how should I move the character? Should it be like, if I'm talking about a PC game, should I move it by click? Do I move it by holding down something? Then again, like if you might want to make a multi-platform game, you have to think about all the different kinds of input that different platforms provide. So if you start listing down all of these features, we also see that this guy has a shield. We have no idea what this means in the gameplay, but this guy has a shield, so that might mean something different as well. Might mean an ability for this creature. Resistances, there's naming for this creature. So there's a lot of layers of complexity to actually traverse through when you start laying down an idea and then expanding it and actually analyzing how many features and how many mechanics you have to implement or think about when you're making a game such as this. Does anybody have any questions about this kind of approach? Or any ideas that they have when they're looking at this particular picture? Yes.
I wanted to say that there's probably also, based on the animation, there might be casting time or channeling time also to the spells.
Yes, exactly. The more you think, the more you look into this picture and try to understand what's happening in the background, the more you will understand how the game works. Of course, there has to be some sort of animation system here as well. So you need to have timings for animations, for example, casting time for balancing. Then you have to think about, okay, so if I get a buff for my casting time and my animation plays in 0.7 seconds, so the casting time is 20% faster, then I should probably make the animation play 20% faster. That's something you might not immediately think about, and when you have already created an asset for the game, like a casting animation, then you get like a casting speed buff, and then you see that your animation is played at ridiculous speeds, and it just looks funny or plain broken, for example, and then you have to redo the animation because you have to take into account all the edge cases. So for example, if you make a casting animation that's meant to be by default played at 1.0 speed, what happens to it if you speed it up, if you make it slower? So that's always something you have to keep in mind. So this is why going into things with a feature-based mindset will help you kind of not foresee these problems per se, but at least you will get a much better picture of where you're going to end up and why. So I have one more exercise. So who knows what this kind of game is? Or how it's called?
Minecraft.
Precisely. It's the age-old favorite Minecraft. So looking for a screenshot about Minecraft on Google is surprisingly difficult because people do a lot of cool stuff in Minecraft. So getting to this screenshot, I had to like go through pages and pages of Minecraft screenshots of like amazing cathedrals and castles. But I wanted to deliberately find a screenshot that has barely anything on it. So I would like you to do the same exercise. What kind of features do you see here? The game is very explicit in telling you what kinds of features you can see here, basically, as well.
Animals, health, armor.
There's animals, so there's other people or actors in the world. You have health, you have armor, that means something.
There might be a lighting system.
Yes.
The torches.
You see the torches, you see some shadowing here as well on the pixels, though this is absolutely having some sort of a rendering engine that deals with lighting and shadows.
First person against the third person before.
Yes, exactly. There's a difference. You are in a first person view, so everything you do here you have to take into account that the player will experience it from a first person perspective.
There's
Anything
an
else?
item durability system.
Sorry?
There's an item durability system.
Yes, you can see that the items have some sort of bar below their icon. So this probably suggests that they have a durability. So does anybody like by heart remember or know the formula behind this durability system? No? Well, basically what happens is that every time you use an item in Minecraft, you roll a die that has X amount of sides based on what material it has and what enchantments it has. So every time you're using it, like to chop this block, for example, you're rolling a dice, you're rolling like one die every time you interact with it to determine whether if you complete the interaction, you will reduce one durability point on this. And what happens is that once you get better materials and once you have better enchantments, the chances that you will reduce a durability point just decrease. It's not that an item is inherently more durable, you just reduce the chance of losing a health point on an item. So this is a very interesting approach to durability, and it's different from, for example, how Diablo-like games do it. Because there, you only lose durability when you use the item no matter what. So this is, like, for me, it was fascinating when I found this out, because I wanted to know what makes this kind of system tick. And by looking at it, like when you just play Minecraft, you don't think about these things just happen, your things just break, they lose durability. But when you start thinking about it, you're like, there has to be some sort of formula behind this. And then, lo and behold, it's actually completely different from a very simplistic approach. It's actually a complex probability machine. So, like behind a seemingly very simple feature can be like terrifying maths, essentially. Any other features that you would see, for example, just by looking at this picture?
Tools and materials to build with.
Yeah, so you have tools. You can probably use some of these tools in the world, on some of these objects that you see on these blocks, and you can carry some of these blocks. So if you put 1 plus 1 together, you're like, okay, so I can probably build something if I put one block next to another one. And this is also why Minecraft is so damn addictive. It puts together a very, very simple set of features and have a very complex backend. So basically, these two examples of games, Path of Exile and Minecraft, are very similar but very different games. Because Path of Exile's complexity comes through to the player as complex. Because if we look at this, there's so much happening here. And you can imagine that there's going to be like tons of mathematics behind this as well. Like how do I compute like the casting time, the damage, resistances, stats, distance? There's a lot of stuff. And when you look at this, you're like, oh, this is so nice and simple. And when you actually try to start making this kind of system yourself, it doesn't really matter if you're making an ARPG or a Minecraft clone, they're quite similar in complexity. Because when you start writing out these features one by one, again, your hand is going to be tired and your brain is going to be pretty much exploding because there's a lot going on in the back end. Any questions? No? Then I will proceed. So how would you go about defining these features that would make up your idea? The first step that I always take is to isolate the mechanics. When I'm thinking about a feature that I want the player to kind of experience then or play through, then I want to immediately set the boundaries of where player interaction starts and ends. Because in the end, the player has limited tools to experience your game, and it's the tools that you allow them to use that will give them this experience. So let's say that I want to make a first-person shooter, then obviously I want as a player to control my character with arrow keys or with WASD, or if you're an infidel, then with S, Z, X, and C. Sometimes people also use this layout. But basically you want to move your character and you want to point gun and shoot gun. So you have these mechanics. Those are very simple. Now we can start building up some features on top of these mechanics. What would be fun in a first-person game? Well, shooting guns, obviously. But if you just have a point-and-shoot mechanic, well, yeah, that's pretty much the mechanic in every first-person shooter game. So why not come up with more wacky guns? There's, I think it was in Painkiller, that's an old FPS. There's a gun that shoots shurikens and lightning. It's not just a simple gun. It has something that has a feature. Basically that's a feature of the game. You have a gun that shoots shurikens and lightning. It's not something run-of-the-mill, like you have a Glock in your hand and you're James Bond and you're like pew pew. But you have some sort of visual effects, some gameplay interaction. It's a fully fledged feature. And I can tell you for a fact that the gun that shoots shurikens and lightning is fun. It's actually fun. So whenever you start defining a feature, you have to evaluate the fun factor for it as soon as you can. Try to figure out whether people would actually enjoy this feature or would it feel more like a chore. If it feels more like a chore, then you can redesign it or repurpose this feature for something else in the game. The third step would be, once you have a solid idea of how the player is going to enact their will in the game, you want to refine this approach. So back to the first-person game example, we have a gun that shoots all kinds of funny stuff out. Then you want to figure out what would be the most optimal way for the player to actually get to this gun. Should it feel like a reward when you get it for the first time? How do you want to make the player feel when they first get it? When you're using the game mechanics to teach them how to use it in certain situations, or you want them to use it as much as possible because it's shurikens and lightning. So this is the step where you need to figure out how to best deliver this feature to the player, and also it's the best stage where to write down all of the ideas you have for this specific feature. So a feature can be anything. It can be double jump, for example, where the mechanic is pressing the jump key twice, for example. It can be a special gun. It can be a spell. It can be, for example, customizable windows in a game, or window sizes. Because it can be anything that you dream up. You can have any sort of feature in the game, but it probably has some sort of mechanics and it needs to give the player some sort of value. And once you have all of this figured out, what you want your feature to be, write it down, give it to somebody else to read, and see what they think about it. Do they think it makes sense? Like, get them on board with your idea, try to explain how it's supposed to work, and if you see the spark in their eyes, then you're probably going in the right direction. And once you have this kind of first sanity check done, that okay, this makes sense, I should try it out, then you're ready to define the feature for yourself and actually start prototyping it. Because you might spend way too much time trying to make something work without thinking about it beforehand, that when you are trying to prototype it, you don't know where you're going because you haven't taken the step back to actually analyze it as a feature and figure out what it's supposed to communicate to the player. So how do you refine your features? How do you get to that third step of refining the design of your game? Basically, the number one key is get feedback as early as possible from as many people as possible, and also, well, everybody's their own biggest critic. Also try to criticize this feature that you're planning yourself as well. So whenever you're trying to come up with a new feature, get people's opinion on it. Also yourself, try to take a step back and see if it would make sense, because it's very easy to get lost in a feature and get kind of to empathize with it too much, and then it's going to become harder to let go. Then secondly, you want to create shortcuts for yourself, and these shortcuts can come in many varieties. The most immediate shortcut you should have when you're trying to refine a feature is to the people who give you feedback. Because if you're trying to come up with something cool, something that's gripping, you need to get feedback for it as fast as possible. So you should probably have a communication channel to whoever gives you the feedback. Doesn't stop there, of course. Another shortcut would be how to iterate on this feature idea once you actually have started implementing it, writing it down, for example, how to modify this feature in the shortest amount of time possible that you can get another round of feedback. How to actually do that or to create that would depend on what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to, for example, again, trying to test out, like, let's go back to the real-time strategy game. You want to prototype unit movement so that unit movement feels crisp, nice, fast and responsive, and you want this to be a multiplayer game. So just make a multiplayer sandbox project where the only game mechanic there that is allowed is unit movement. And you don't actually go anywhere, you don't go further until you see that, okay, the movement is perfect now. We're going to go on to the next step and implement attacking, for example. And make sure that when you have this kind of approach, that you minimize the amount of time that you spend there as well. That basically what that means is that if you're a coder, don't write the most beautiful code in the world. Just make it work. First make it work and then make it pretty. Because if you have a prototype, you are probably going to throw it away anyway. If you make a prototype for a feature, then it's going to be knowledge that you take away from the implementation of this feature yourself and bring it to whatever is coming next. The prototype itself should die, because otherwise you will end up with a buggy code base, messy assets, etc. So if you make a prototype for features, then be prepared to throw a lot of stuff out the window. So for example, if we want to make a very rudimentary RTS game, for example like Age of Empires, so we want to have resource collection, unit attacking, like health handling, building, AI, then we're probably going to have like 10 different prototype projects for all the different features, seeing if they work on their own, and then putting them together would be making the actual game. You don't need to have one prototype to prototype all of the features at once. You can do that, but then when you start out in going like full production with it, going full blast with the development, you still probably want to get rid of the prototype implementations and all of the prototype assets as well, because they might usually, when you write like a piece of code or you create an art asset once that you have never done before, then next time you do it, you're going to be exponentially better and faster at it. You will create, if you do something from scratch again, using the experience that you just accumulated, that you learned, you leveled up your skill basically as a designer, as a coder, as an artist. The next time you start doing the same exact task, it will go much faster for you and you will probably make it a lot cleaner. So that's it for the shortcuts. And what do I mean by a network is basically create a network of people that you trust, that you can rely on, that whenever you would need feedback, for example, whenever you want to get inspiration from somebody, then you have somebody to go to. So whenever you actually have a desire to kind of, let's say, you want to show off what you just prototyped, it's perfectly fine to go on Twitter and spam about it the entire weekend and get a good number of feedback, and also to maybe get new followers, to get more engagements with your ideas, and this is all positive reinforcement for yourself. It's perfectly fine to share your prototype stuff on social media because somebody might give you a new perspective that you did not know that you could have. Or you can also just show it to your friends, your spouse, your family, etc. Just make sure that you have a network that you can turn to. If you have a question about something, like how do I make this asset, like how do I texture this, how do I UV map it, how am I supposed to animate this, like I came up with a 12-legged creature but I have no idea how I'm supposed to animate it, then make sure that you have somebody you can ask it from. And if not, then include that in your network somehow. Create a network where it's hard for you to kind of fall off the wagon, because if you're trying to prototype a feature somehow, then get it done as soon as possible, because if you hit a hurdle somewhere, it's going to hurt your motivation and it's definitely going to hurt the quality of your analysis as well. Now the psychological part of feature refining. What is a very common mistake in doing design, game design, is overthinking things. So whenever you're coming up with features or their implementations or algorithms behind it, make sure that you take time for yourself to do something else. Distract yourself, rest from handling this one topic at a length. Like for example, working on one feature for a week is already way too much. If you're spending that much time that's supposed to be focus time on a small bit of a game, then the quality of your work is going to suffer a little bit. You need to take a step back somehow, either by discussing it with other people, but trying to solve this problem from the get-go to the nitty-grittiest detail might hurt you in the long run, because it might put you into a box of thinking that you can't really get out of. And then you try to solve the problem that you're trying to solve with very inefficient methods. So do something else. Do something that doesn't require your brain to be like super wired. For example, go running, go take a walk, draw something, or when you're actually trying to do a visual prototype, don't draw something, and for example, read a book. And whatever you do, you should always reward yourself if you're doing focused work. That's what I mean with reward focus. What I specifically mean by it is that if you manage to do like mental work, for example, when you're thinking about a feature, trying to figure out how it would be implemented, then make sure that this is the best way you could be spending your time on this idea, and give yourself something back when you do this. And if you see that you are drifting away in your thoughts, if you're supposed to be thinking about this feature, you're supposed to be thinking about this design, but you cannot get something out of your head, then don't force yourself too much to stay in this sort of uncomfortable situation where you want to do something, but your mind is engaged in something else. This is bad behavior, and it also leads to quality deficiency, basically. Try to reward yourself for every time you focus well, so you start doing it more, and whenever you start losing your focus, take a step back. And if you really see that you have spent a lot of time on one specific feature, or like, let's say, you want to really put your time into this prototype and you feel like it's gonna give you like a huge reward when you finish it, you push play in the game engine and dopamine will explode in your head. It might not. So try not to overcommit to your own features, and try to let go if you see that this isn't going somewhere, and start over. Because if you start over from a clean slate, again, like I said before, you can tackle the same problem with all the experience that you had, but you just have a clean slate. So you don't have to murder your head over this one specific thing. It's perfectly fine to scrap all of your work because you still retain the experience. For example, by now I've written like inventory system implementations about 30 times in my life, and I don't want to use a ready-made solution for it, even if it's my own, because I know that every time I need to write an inventory system, it's going to be better than the previous one. So I started it out in Java, then I started working in Unreal 4, then I moved to Blueprints, then I saw that, okay, Blueprints kind of suck, so for making a very complex system, so I went to write this inventory system in C++, and I was like, okay, cool, now let's try it in Unity. So I started writing an inventory system in C#, and I have like 4 to 5 iterations in all of these languages, and every time I do that, I start over. And what it does is that the first time that I made an inventory system in Java took me about 30 hours to make it. Now I can make an inventory system in 2 hours in any language, just because the idea for me, I know how to estimate it, I know what kind of problems I have to solve, so every time I made a new iteration, I shave off time required for the next implementation, for example. This goes to art as well, so you can draw the same dragon 20 times over and over again, and every time you draw this dragon, it becomes more detailed, more refined, and you do it just a little bit faster. So if you don't adhere to this, then you might end up in a situation where you're broken and you have a bottle of vodka in your hands thinking, where has my life led me? So try to let go of stress somehow. Don't push yourself too hard if you cannot figure out a solution to a problem. Take a step back and see where you would end up if you would start over again. It's perfectly fine. Now to actual prototyping. So there's a few methods available that I have used myself. I'm not going to cover any methods that I haven't used myself in this talk. And I have used 3 very specific methods of how to prototype a feature. The first one is physical prototyping. Would anybody want to guess what that means?
Paper.
Yes, pretty much. 9 times out of 10 we're talking about pen and paper and a couple of scissors and maybe a stick of glue if you have the budget. So essentially what you want to do is you want to offload the idea from your head onto a table and see how it would work if you can physically touch it, interface with it somehow, without having to go through the painstaking process of having somebody code something, draw something, implement it, put it in the version control system, whatever, and then you just want to go and test it out how this works in real life. So for example, if I would be making a multiplayer real-time strategy game, I would just cut out some pieces of cardboard or paper, glue them together, paint them a little bit, make sure that whoever I'm trying to like prototype this with, or if I'm doing it myself, then I know what symbol means what, and then seeing how it would work on the tabletop, and see if there's already some kinds of simplifications that I can make, if there's something I haven't thought about. Like for example, if I use my fingertip to move a token on the table, then that probably means I would need to do it in the digital world with a pointer, with a mouse, for example. So you can already start to work through the problem you have using analogy. It's a great way of simplifying problems for yourself, but it does carry the risk of oversimplification. I will come back to that later. The second method is programmatic or algorithmic. Again, does anybody want to guess what this means? It's very close to the first one that mentions paper.
Write a unit test to the basic functionality.
Basically, yes. Essentially what you do is you have an idea of a feature for a game, however it should work. You make something in code that executes it for you. It doesn't have to have anything fancy. It literally can be a text window that engages with you in conversation. Like for example, you would have a text-based adventure to explain your feature. So you would go write a very simple program, and this is easier than learning any sort of game engine. For example, you download Visual Studio, you start a new C# project that you can see. You have an input text field and another button that has enter. And then you use this text field to parse some input. So for example, if you would write cast spell into this text field and click the button, then you would, for example, the console would say to you, casting spell or casting fireball, and then you can take it one step further. You can say cast fireball at distance or at target, and then the program would tell you what would happen then. So essentially what you're doing is you're making an automated system for yourself to validate your idea. It doesn't require much coding experience, but of course if you are a coder, then it's going to be a lot easier for you. But I want to stress this, that it is going to be easier than learning any sort of game engine. Because if you deal with an engine, most of the time you're 5 minutes in and you're like, oh, I'm all set. I have the scene ready, I have all the models in the game ready, and I want to see how it works. And then you're like, now I need to write code, and you have no idea where to start. So you start reading through the documentation, and then after 3 days of reading documentation, doing coding tutorials, you're not even making your game anymore. You're not working on a prototype. The idea is to get something tested. So if you just try to put your idea into an automated like state machine in a smaller code project, you might have immediate feedback about how your feature might work. This kind of system is more suited to simulation games, for example, or games that have to have some sort of a state machine in them. So action games don't super benefit from this, but for example, if you want to make a dialogue system for a game, there is no reason why you should do it in an engine immediately, because the dialogue system is already a feature big enough to warrant its own implementation. So you might be quicker in trying it out, whether you make a physical prototype of a dialogue system, like make a dialogue tree with a bunch of cardboard, or make it in a short code snippet and see how it works there. Also, there's a very important disclaimer about any and all prototyping. You are probably going to have a problem with maths or physics. At any time, if you want to make something move or explode, it needs to have some sort of physics logic or mathematical logic behind it. The four most important aspects of maths and physics in games, in my opinion, are statistics to calculate probabilities and just analyze stuff. Trigonometry to get angular movement, and then kinematics, which is basically velocity and acceleration of things, movement. If you have these like topics ingrained in your head at a very basic level, you're gonna have a sweet time prototyping stuff. So, yeah, this is physical prototyping. You get people behind the desk, you get some cardboard, you get some paint, nail polish, glue, whatever, and then you start thinking how your game would work. It can be anything. It can be, you can do a board game like this as well. This is how board games are prototyped. You can prototype strategy games, action games, story-based games, anything. Like for example, if you want to make a game like Life is Strange, which is an adventure game basically, you can set up scenes on the paper and then recreate them in engine once you actually know what you want to create. So you don't waste the time using the engine, because it takes a lot of time doing stuff in engine usually. It does put you into the limit of what you can craft is what you get essentially. So, but you don't have to go too complex with it. You can get some simple feedback immediately. You can make changes in this system very, very fast, because you can just make new cardboard figures. You can make up new rules reusing the cardboard figures. It's just very, very fast in terms of feedback. Plus, if you're doing it with a bunch of people, it's also super, super fun, because it's engaging. You get immediate feedback, you get like an immediate burst of dopamine in your brain again, like, yeah, we did this, it's a good idea, now let's try it in the engine later on. The downside, okay, there's supposed to be a minus sign here. It is a little bit hard to share, so if you have friends online, then you need to probably have a video bridge of your table, or you need to like mail your prototype to your friends, so that can be a very, very limiting factor. So whenever you're physically prototyping things, it's best if you do it alone, so you have yourself, or you have somebody else who's physically next to you as well. One other big downside is that whatever you're trying to think about, you might not be able to execute with just pen, paper, and cardboard. So it might be a far cry from what you're actually trying to design, but that's just something to keep in mind when you're using this technique, because always the idea behind physical prototyping is just put in some time into this, so I understand the problem, and then later on put it into a game engine anyway. Because this is just the first step to validate an idea to see if it's even worth bothering doing. If you see that a feature would be completely pointless or doesn't warrant the effort, you can cut it here, and then you wouldn't even make it into the engine. Before you start any sort of computer program, you already know that, okay, this feature is probably not going to go in. Next up is the algorithmic prototyping. What you can do here is either write a short program or make a flowchart with instructions, with what's supposed to happen. You explain your feature visually in a standardized manner. This also helps other people to understand how your design works. Some people really hate flowcharts, but in this case they can be super useful. Because, for example, let's go back to having a spell casting system. So what are the rules for the spell casting? First, you cast the spell, there's a casting delay, like let's say half a second. Then when does the mana get subtracted? Is it at the time of casting? Is it when the casting time is over, or is it subtracted when the casting animation has finished? There are multiple ways where you can do this, and if you put it into an algorithm, you can immediately understand how this feature is supposed to unveil itself in front of the player. So let's say I'm playing Path of Exile, I use my right mouse button to use an ability, then I see that, aha, okay, my mana gets subtracted as soon as the ability activates. That's quite fair. So if I would get interrupted while doing the casting animation, I would still retain my mana points. Or you can have the system where immediately where you press the mouse button, the mana gets subtracted. So if you do get interrupted somehow, like stunned or whatever, you lose the mana and tough luck. You just lost a bunch of mana and the game is maybe being a little bit unfair to you, or maybe it's just being a little bit more difficult. So this helps you lay down the rules for your game and optimize your mechanics. What kind of player experience you would want the player to have, essentially. Why I would encourage this kind of prototyping is that, compared to in-engine prototyping, is that it reduces the temptation to make something more complex immediately once you have finished this prototype for the feature. Because if you are working in the engine and you see, oh nice, I made a really cool system for casting spells and making fireballs, then it's like, oh, I'm gonna try all of these different things. And you might write yourself into a corner with your designs because you overcomplicated things. This way, you kind of don't give yourself the freedom to expand on your own design too much, so you don't put too much time into thinking about the feature, which reduces the risk of overthinking, basically. This type of approach is very good if you want to crunch numbers or need to crunch numbers, like for example, any sort of experience table in any game ever, like an RPG game or a strategy game. Like, what is the algorithm when the player gets experience rewards? Is it at every step of a quest? Is it at the end of a quest? Do they get experience from hitting a monster, or from killing a monster, or from hugging the monster? There can be many, many different options, and if you define them beforehand and think about those and think about the mechanics, then you will spend less time worrying about the pitfalls or the problems that might arise when you put it into the engine. Again, it's a good method to use if you're a little bit familiar with coding. You don't have to be, but it will be hard to start out even with this frame of thinking if you are not accustomed to solving problems per algorithm. This also means that it has definitely a slower iteration time than physical prototyping, because it takes time writing code. It takes time reading Google and Stack Overflow to make sure that you're writing the thing the way you're supposed to, and you're getting unexpected, like some sort of expected result from whatever code you have written. And yeah, of course, it requires actual coding, so some people are very, very uncomfortable with this, sometimes even myself. So basically, don't stress out yourself over the method, just choose something that works for yourself. And sometimes the best version or the best course to take is going into an actual game engine. So this is the traditional or the de facto standard approach in today's industry, which has some really good sides and then some really, really bad sides. There's a lot of choices for game engines that you can choose. Some that come with the disclaimer of you need to know programming, and some saying, ooh, we are very friendly, we have visual scripting, you don't have to write a single line of code. They're all lying to you. In the end, you need to have somebody writing some code, you need to have somebody doing some art, and you need to have somebody thinking about some design. So whenever you go into an engine, you are going to need information about it. When you make a physical prototype, the only thing you need to know is how to use a pair of scissors. If you go into Unity engine, you probably need to know how C# works, you need to know how Unity handles its assets, you need to know how to import stuff into the engine, you need to know how to add libraries into the engine. It's a lot of heavy lifting for one person to do. So if you do commit to an engine to make a prototype, then it super helps if you're already familiar with it. So if you really insist on using an engine for your prototype, then definitely, unless you're trying to learn something new, go with what you already know. If it's not the best fit for the project, that doesn't matter. This is a prototype, it's likely going to be thrown away anyway. For example, the prototype for Heroes of Might and Magic 7 was made in Unity Engine. The end product was made in Unreal Engine 3. So it doesn't really matter where you make the prototype as long as you understand what kind of problem you have to solve. So the people who made the Unity prototype were absolutely more comfortable and more fast and efficient at their work using Unity, but they already knew that likely the better choice in the future, if they would get the project, would be Unreal Engine 3. And they scrapped the entire Unity project. And that's perfectly fine as well. It's helpful if you know what you're getting yourself into, if you know the limits of yourself and your team. So if I want to make a really quick prototype, I would first look at, if I want to make it in an engine, I would first look at the problem I'm trying to solve. Like for example, I recently tried to learn multiplayer networking in Unity, and I had really no idea where to start, and I made a prototype for multiplayer stuff in Unreal 4, and I was like, okay, this is really cool. So I tried some ideas out, I tried out some algorithms, and I was like, okay, so I have the basics done, and then I ported it all over to Unity, and apparently the multiplayer networking part wasn't even that difficult, but only because I thought about the problems that I had to solve beforehand, and I did that work in another engine. It's perfectly fine to switch. There's a lot of choices for engines nowadays. The two most prevalent out there is Unreal Engine 4. It's a really remarkable game engine, honestly, but only if you know how it works. If you are just starting out with something, and if you're starting out on your first game prototype ever, you have never touched any other engine, Unreal might even be the best place to start out, but it might not be the best place to stay in. Why? It's because Unreal gives you a lot of tools to get a prototype running. It has built-in templates for pretty much any popular game mode, like top-down view, like top-down action RPG, racing game, strategy view, flying game, first-person shooter. It has a template for pretty much anything that you would need to get up and started immediately. And the best part is that it has visual scripting. So while you're not actually writing code, you still have to think in algorithms and coding. And there's not too many tutorials about this, but if you are very practical in your approach and are very comfortable with learning things by yourself and not at the guidance of others, then you can get a lot of stuff done very quickly in Unreal Engine 4. Just purely because they have such a strong visual scripting backend, and it's completely free and open source, so yay! Unity, on the other hand, is pretty much the indie standard nowadays. A lot of indie studios use this. A lot of AAA studios use Unity to prototype games as well. I kind of spoiled this, but has anybody played Hearthstone by Blizzard?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, Hearthstone. And does anybody know which engine Hearthstone is running? It's Unity. It's not Blizzard's own engine, actually. They used Unity internally to make a quick prototype to see if it works. Surprise, it worked, and then they turned it into a product still using Unity. So it's actually a legitimate strategy to prototype your stuff in an engine, even if you're a big company that you don't own. This is fine. It's all down to the licensing. And if you're starting out yourself, it's not a bad choice. It has a very mellow learning curve. It has amazing amounts of tutorials and materials of what to do, how to implement, how to integrate. If you search Unity and any search phrase on YouTube, there's probably a video made out of it, like a step-by-step video, and it has a very, very wide and helpful community. So even if you don't find a solution for your problem immediately, you can ask a question on the forums, on the boards, and you'll probably get an answer the same day, the same hour if you're lucky, just because it has a tremendous community and good engagement. So Unity is a very, very strong choice if you want to make something that at least in some manner has been done before. It's really easy to go into it. Then there's Godot engine, which is pretty much the same as Unity, uses different scripting languages, but it's open source. Unity is proprietary, and they generally don't give out their source code unless you give them a lot of money. So that makes Godot a very, very accessible engine. It has pretty much the same rendering capabilities as Unity, and it's actually progressing very, very, very quickly because it doesn't have a centralized team who's doing it. It's open source, has a very helpful community, very good learning curve because you can transfer knowledge from Unity tutorials into Godot tutorials actually. They do so many things similarly, you just have to change the language of the code pretty much, if you're talking about code. But visually they are very similar even.
Which language is Godot?
They have some sort of a language that's close to JavaScript, but I'm not 100% sure.
That's
Wasn't it close to Python?
Yeah,
I think
something,
it
yeah.
was close to Python, and
Yes.
they tried to make it more accessible than Python.
Yes.
And they still think it's a good idea. It's called GD script, I
Yes,
think?
exactly, GDScript, exactly. And it's, I took a look at it, I've taken a look at it actually multiple times. It's not bad. It's untyped, so you can just, most of the time you can write code and not worry about the errors unless there's something that explodes in your face. So it's quite accessible, it's fast to iterate because you don't have to follow a lot of coding conventions. For example, for Unreal Engine, if you go aside the visual scripting part, on the other end you have C++, and unless you have very ambitious ideas, then you are going to have a problem with C++ because everything breaks at every time, and it doesn't break elegantly, it just crashes. So yeah, making a decision of what kind of engine should also depend on what kind of technical capacity you and your teammates have, if you have any. Then last but not least, GameMaker. GameMaker is one of the fastest tools available to get a working game prototype out in like a very limited amount of time. It's rival to, like, it has no rivals essentially in this list because there's a lot of parts you can plug and play. You can get a lot of community help. You can use Google. It's widely used, but it is commercial. You have to pay for it at least until the trial runs out. But it's still a very, very neat engine, and it has a free version as well. The only problem with it is that it's not super elegant when it comes down to complex stuff, because if you want to write a complex system, you might be helped by the limitations of the other engines and their scripting backends, because it's quite easy to end up in a situation in GameMaker where you write up a system and you have no idea why it works and you have no idea when it doesn't work. Debugging, etc., you can do it, but you have to be aware of it. You have to understand how to debug this. You have to understand there's not much control you have over the code you write. So whenever you prototype stuff in GameMaker, just take it into account, but generally it's amazing. It's great, and it has come a long way. First time I used GameMaker was in 2002 or something. I was 11. So, and even then I managed to make a game that was sort of like Pac-Man. I don't have pictures of it, but it was amazing. So whenever you want to choose an engine, if you're dead set on prototyping your ideas in an engine, make sure you choose the engine based on what the problem is. Yes?
So Construct as well.
Yes.
I think it's like Game Maker, and it's really easy to use. I recommend it, but if you want to do anything more complex, then it's not the thing to use. It's just for getting you started really quickly, like extremely quickly to just, there's lots of bases, so you can use those bases and put your ideas right in.
Yeah, Construct is a great example as well. There are other game engines like Amazon's Lumberyard, which is basically CryEngine. There's CryEngine as well. If you want to, you can try out CryEngine. Then sometimes you might have the wild idea that you could also prototype a game idea in another game that has a modding suite. This actually happens. For example, you can make games in Dota 2. You can make games in StarCraft 2. You can make games in Elder Scrolls 5, Skyrim. You can make games in Oblivion and Morrowind as well, but you have to understand what those tools allow you to do. So, it all depends on where you feel comfortable. If you feel comfortable solving problems because you've made a mod for Skyrim before, try it out in Skyrim. It's going to be easier than learning any sort of engine, and then you will get fast feedback for yourself whether there's any point in putting time into this prototype at all. So you get quick answers for yourself. And the whole idea between rapid prototyping is that spend as little time as possible to get maximum results. You don't want to end up like this, where you just crash every second time you launch the goddamn Unreal 4 editor because you don't even know what you did wrong. This is the problem with engines. They're great until they stop working for no reason whatsoever, because what is this? This is not an error report. You can do nothing with it, essentially. And if you don't know where to start solving your problem, you're gonna have a bad time. So whenever you choose a method in which to prototype your ideas, make sure you're making an informed decision. And the key takeaway from going over these methods on how to work or what tools to use is to make your own templates, because this is the place where you start optimizing your own work. If you start doing physical prototyping, if you do it once, you're like, okay, I need some tokens, I need to have a stick of glue, a pair of scissors, a pencil, and a pen. Every time you do something again with the same setup, you're gonna come up with better and better ideas how to do things faster. Like maybe fold the paper and then cut it instead of cutting every piece out like one by one. That's actually a thing. It's optimization. And if you use a game engine, you can do pretty much the same thing, just with code, with assets. So what I do is that whenever I see that, okay, I'm beginning to repeat myself, I remember this, I've done this before, then I try to isolate it and then make it into its own separate thing so I can quickly reuse it if I have need for it. I have a template for hyper-casual games that I could make on mobile, that I could just make a new project, slap in some gameplay, and it's done in 2 days. I don't have to worry about writing a main menu, a UI, input management, rendering stuff, making things work properly in all resolutions. I don't have to worry about that because I have a template which I can use to already solve half the problems I'm trying to solve if I want to get an idea going. Because a lot of the times, if you're prototyping something, you will go through a lot of repetitive stuff. You will write logic for getting player input from the mouse, from the computer mouse, like 50 times in your life when you're starting out in games immediately, because Like, there's only so many times I can be bothered to write input.get key down mouse 0, so I try to reuse all of that stuff so I don't have to write it all the time over and over again. And this is what I encourage other people to do as well. Whatever you do when you're prototyping, try to understand that if you are making something for the second time, you're probably going to make it a third time, and maybe you're better off if you make a template out of it. It doesn't have to be solid, it doesn't have to cover all the bases, but at least you will save some time once you actually want to get an idea going. So what should a good template have? And I'm going to talk about engine-specific stuff right now. First of all, the most important thing is the way that game objects in the engine initialize. This is a thing that many game engines expect their developers and users to do inherently, but nobody does this because they don't say do this, they expect you to do this, but they don't tell you this thing. So what I mean by that is that, for example, in Unity engine, you have game objects. Every time you put a game object into a level or a scene, that it's named in Unity, then if you start a game session, then all of these game objects start executing their behavior in basically no order whatsoever. And if you have dependencies between some of these objects, if one object spawns before another object, you're screwed. You have to figure out how to make the other object spawn before the first object, and that already includes making a system for initialization orders. So whenever I make a template, that's the first thing I do. I create what I call a game manager class, and then in the game manager class I have a list of stuff in the exact order I want to put into the game world, making sure that I don't run into these annoying dependencies. Because whenever you're starting with a bigger project, this problem is not going to show itself before it's too late, before you're already screwed in more ways than you can imagine. So it's best to have this done immediately. So you don't have a situation where you have a dude who's in a level and they're supposed to make a sound when they appear into the world, but the sound manager isn't initialized yet, so your game crashes. That's a very interesting problem that I have run into so many times that I decided to just use this pattern of having a central controller that tells other objects when they're allowed to start with their behaviors. And this can be used in any engine, because all of the engines available in modern times have this issue, and you have to solve it yourself. The second thing that is tremendously helpful if you want to reuse stuff is input handling. Like whenever you have to write a system of what happens when the player presses W, what happens when they press the left mouse button or the right mouse button, or when they do something with the scroll wheel. You can just write this once and rewrite all of the consequences of these actions as your idea needs to. You just have to write the basic input capture and then fill out the mechanics later. This will just save you some time. The third most important thing is persistence. This means save games. This is not required for a lot of prototypes, but for example, mobile games, this is super important. How are you going to save the player's progress? How are you going to save their high score, for example? If you don't have a way to do this immediately, you're going to have to write it. And if you're making a lot of mobile game ideas, you're going to write it like 10 times every month. So instead of writing it 10 times every month, put it in your template so you don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. Then some user interface functions can also be reused. For example, making a basic heads-up display, making a basic menu loading system. Like you would have two scenes, one for the menu, one for the game, and in the menu scene you would have an actual main menu where you click play and it just takes you to an empty scene. That's your template. That's all you need to do, and you have already made your project more structured. So the whole idea behind using templates is to reuse as much as possible to make sure that you're not wasting time on doing something that could have been done beforehand, and accelerating your progress and making sure that any motivation and desire you have to do like cool stuff in your prototype, you don't waste it. You actually put this effort somewhere. Because if I get an idea, I need to get it out immediately, because if I'm gonna just let it like sit there, the next day, like half of the idea I've already forgotten, and the other half I don't care about anymore. So no use in just letting them sit and die. If you have an idea, get it out, and if possible, get it out as fast as possible. So time management. Luckily, we're hitting the end slides soon, so there's not much left. But time is pretty much going to be the only metric that you have to worry about when you're making a prototype. Set a very specific constraint for yourself and try to not do less than that or more than that. It really helps, because this way you can measure that, okay, I worked over the weekend, I worked 8 hours on Saturday, I worked 8 hours on Sunday, that's 16 hours, and I got this much done, and I estimated that I would get this much done. And then you can compare how much did I do versus how much I was planning to do, and this helps you plan ahead. The more you make these prototypes, you get more accustomed to estimating your own work, and at the same time you will become more efficient because you're doing these exercises with yourself. You become more proficient at your skill set, essentially. When you are making a feature prototype or a game prototype, focus only on the critical stuff and cut out the rest that is just fluff, that is visual, for example, that's not important for the prototype to convey to the player. Because, for example, if you make a visual prototype, then you don't want to have a lot of gameplay. You want the gameplay to be as simple as possible, so that you don't show any complexity. Any complexity you can just fake there and put all of your efforts into getting the visuals correct. And just focus on the core, what you're trying to achieve with the prototype. Again, make feature prototypes, not game prototypes. If you want to make a nice lighting scene in 3D that has a very nice atmospheric environment, then you don't have to have much gameplay there. Just take Unreal 4 first-person template, you have a crosshair, you can move around, and you make the nice environment, and bam, you have it. You don't have to add gameplay if that's not the thing you want to focus on. Then always think about how the players of your game would perceive it. So emphasize the user experience aspect when you are designing features. Make sure that you're trying to think how the player would see this, and that it would be fun for them somehow. So if you have a game feature that you feel like gets old really quickly, you can bet your ass that your players are going to feel like that as well, unless they're super masochistic. But again, depends on who are you making this game for. Try to always keep that in mind. And the last part is always learn to let go at the right time. Don't put in too much effort to a single feature. So if you say, I'm going to make a game prototype in 3 months, it's going to take me 120 hours, that's 40 hours every month, then if I see there's not something that's working, if I've already put 10 hours into it, I don't want to put another 10, another 20 hours into it, because that's already so much from my remaining time budget that the rest of the ideas that I want to implement would suffer tremendously. And that's all part of the fail fast mentality, basically. If you see that a design has failed, just let go of it, take a step back, start over, design it better, and maybe, just maybe, one short iteration over this feature is all that it needed to get it to be fun. And where you can put this into practice, essentially the prime example of how to make prototypes quickly, efficiently, with a constraint are game jams. We're going to have a game jam with APT GameGenerator 4th to 7th October, so in 3 weeks. So if anybody wants to come and try their skills and to see if they would test their mettle in making a prototype quickly, then a game jam is the best place to do it. You can find many other game jams online. Just go to Google and type in game jam, and you will get a lot of ongoing game jams. There's weekly game jams happening every week that are different. There's thematic game jams happening pretty much every week or other week. There's people organizing their own private game jams online. You can travel to Latvia, they're having game jams there. There's game jams in Finland. You can take the boat or the plane. But again, there's very, very easy methods of joining a game jam. Just do it online, do it at home, take time for yourself, take a vacation if you need to, or a few days after the game jam, because you're gonna be screwed if you don't. Game jams are super intense, and just try and put your ideas, put features into practice, because game jams, since they're usually super time constrained, they force you to prototype features and not fully fledged games. So even if you want to make a short platformer, you're going to be super lucky if you can only get the jump mechanic in, because it needs to work perfectly. Because at the end of the game jam, people are going to play your game, and if you're making a platformer, jumping better work. If that doesn't work, then that's already like bad. So you constrain yourself to commit to at least some sort of excellence in one specific feature. Then do a lot of research, play games, reverse engineer games. Take your favorite game, or maybe don't take your favorite game because you might ruin it. Take a game that you pretty much liked playing, or you slightly disliked playing, so you figured out why you liked this game and why you didn't like this other game. Try to deconstruct the features they have into this kind of tree and see if you can make sense out of it, like what bothered you in this game. Was it the way that, I don't know, my mana regenerated? Was it the way that I didn't have enough bullets for my guns in these levels? Find out what's the thing that was niggling in the back of your head, and try to put it into words for yourself, so whenever you're designing something similar yourself, you don't fall into the same hole. And of course you can find your own outlet to try out this idea, like just making stuff at home, showing them to your friends, family, etc. Is perfectly fine. Just keep on prototyping stuff, prototype things in short bursts, make sure you don't burn yourself out, and try to share it with as many people as you feel comfortable with, to make sure you get some feedback on whether you're going in the right direction or if you should start thinking about it another way. So, yeah, whenever you prototype something, then this is the expected result. This is a screenshot from Assassin's Creed Unity. Somehow the game itself shipped with having this kind of plugin. So whenever you're prototyping stuff, this is the thing that's most likely to happen. And when you prototype stuff as much as possible, figure out the mistakes as much as possible to avoid them, then you will not end up like this in your final product. Hopefully. And again, what I would like everybody to take away from this talk is try to figure out how to prototype your features independently instead of going for a huge game idea immediately. And that's it. Otherwise, yeah, this is obvious over-engineering. You can just have a single cigarette and you will be good. You don't have to invent a Sprite bong to have a cigarette. So that's an interesting analogy to take away, but don't make a Sprite bong when you can just smoke a cigarette when you're making games. Thank you. Yeah, any questions? Or tips, pointers anybody would like? A funny story. Yes?
Right now you also develop your own game?
Yes. I'm currently developing 3 games at the same time. I'm developing a PC game that's a narrative-heavy story-based game. I'm developing a hyper-casual mobile game, and I'm also developing a VR game, an entertainment VR game. And I'm doing some consulting work on some other games. Yeah, I work on a lot of stuff at the same time. Yes.
Just more like an anecdote that one of the reasons why I jumped off the boat of GameMaker was when I shockingly find out that they didn't have like proper functions in 1.4. They introduced this as a feature on the newer
next version, yeah.
But it was already too late because when the new version was going to come in, I had already paid for the professional version of GameMaker 1.4, and then I was stuck with it for a while.
Yeah.
Until I just, screw this, I'm going to Unity.
Yeah, this is one reason why it always helps to analyze like what you're trying to do and if you're using the right tool to use it. Because I always like to say that it's a really sucky idea to use a hammer to drive in a screw. You should probably use a screwdriver. So if you're really at world's end and you have no other tool, then a hammer will do, obviously. The screw will go in, but obviously it's not the optimal way of doing it. It's the same way with game engines or libraries that you can attach to game engines. For example, if you're making a simple adventure game that's like point and click, you probably don't need an audio engine that's like third-party licensed, costs like 500 euros a month. You can probably just do something very simple on your own or ask some coder to do it for you for 500 euros period, not 500 euros per month, for example. So it all depends on the problem we're trying to solve. You had a question, I think.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I don't have the experience with it, but in theory, I think a game called Tabletop Simulator might be great for physical prototyping without the limitations. So you can like clone objects, resize them, do whatever.
Yeah, actually, Tabletop Simulator is a great game. It's a game question mark because it's basically a collection of tools that allows you to set up board games. And it has a lot of customizable elements. So yeah, for example, and it also has multiplayer, I believe. So you can test these issues or problems that you're trying to solve also in multiplayer with this game. So yeah, that might actually be a very, very good testing suite for ideas as well.
So yeah, like compared to the physical prototyping, and it also solves the sharing problem because it has multiplayer and saving and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one really good example of a tool that you can use for a specific situation. If you have a feature that you want to try out, you don't want to spend too much time on it, you want to get an answer right now, whether this would be fun or not, go for it.
What was the tool name?
Tabletop Simulator. You can find it on Steam. It's definitely on Steam. Yes?
What under the templates, what kind of stuff do you have for persistence? Is it like serialization or some cloud save services? Or
it's simple serialization. Right now into the hyper-casual template, I also just recently added Google Play Game Service cloud saves as well. But yeah, I have a very, very simple serialization logic. I have one for Unreal 4 and I have one for Unity. And I have one for anything that uses C# since I derived it from Unity. And it's basically, I write all of the persistence stuff that I need, like positions of objects in the game, or scores, or some sort of just values, put them in a list in a separate class, and then this I save as a binary file and then load as necessary. Very, very simplistic serialization. Yes?
It's a weird question. Can you do games without a game engine?
Yes. Like for example, as I explained before with the algorithmic and programmatic, let's say, approach or technique, you can just use .NET, the Microsoft programming framework. You can use Visual Basic, C++ or C# there, and you can actually make a game there. It can be 3D. You will need a 3D rendering library for it. You can also get a 2D rendering library for it, but .NET already knows how to render 2D stuff. So, for example, the game Stardew Valley was made in .NET, effectively. It was made as a custom engine, and part of it was just made in a standard .NET project solution.
An engine is basically syntactic sugar.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Ah,
you can always write your own engine.
Yes, you can always write your own engine.
You will be reinventing a lot of wheels there.
Yeah.
You will reinvent
rendering,
collision detection.
Yeah.
Physics.
Yeah. Two of the biggest reasons why you want to have a game engine in the first place is at first rendering, because whenever you want to game, you need to have some sort of visual feedback for the player. If you just render text, you don't need a specific game engine. You can use the console. You can make a text-based adventure right now just by downloading any sort of coding suite and just putting some code in. And the second reason is physics, because like actual game engines that ship nowadays is basically 3 sub-engines in a trench coat pretending to be one engine. Like Unreal Engine is actually about 11 or 12 sub-modules. Has a networking engine, physics engine, rendering engine, the editor engine as well, that's a separate engine, and destructible environment engine. Wow. So it has a lot of these subsystems that are engines on its own, and together they form this modular game engine. It also, like Unreal 4 also comes with an AI engine that you can enable or disable, and you can quickly integrate some sort of AI behavior in your game if you use this. And it's up to you to figure out whether you want to or not. So essentially, you can make your own game engine. You can use another game engine as your rendering suite, but make all of your logic for the game in some place completely different. This is something that has been used. I think, if I'm not super mistaken, then Cities Skylines, it's a city builder game, has a remarkably large simulation engine that's separate from Unity, and Unity takes care of all the rendering stuff and the UI, but their actual simulation is made in their own libraries that they just inject with DLL, essentially. As if my memory doesn't fail, I might be lying here, but that's how I remember how they do things. So there is no super specific excuse to using an engine other than not having to worry about rendering in physics, because this is the number one thing that you need to solve when you're making a game, usually. And if you don't have a game like that, then you don't have to use an engine.
I'm sorry, we have to leave this room in 8 minutes.
8 minutes?
Yeah.
Perfect.
But thank you for coming, and I'm sure it will answer all your questions if you have some more.
You can post questions on Facebook, for example. You can connect to me on Facebook, add me as a friend, send me a message, anything.
And make sure to attend our season start party in Saturday.
Yes, this
so
Saturday.
There will be free drinks and everything. Sit
Yes.
It's a bar in here.
Yes, there's an event for the season start party on Facebook under the APT GameGenerator page.
Okay.
So you can search for the event there and come join us on Saturday.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.